German infantry lieutenant, vanished in 1944. 81 years later, his snow-buried shelter was found. March 17, 2025. Norwegian Geological Survey Team NGS 447 was conducting routine permafrost stability assessments in the Hardangervidda Plateau. The signature suggested a void space approximately 4 meters below the surface, 12 kilometers from the nearest recorded military installation. Lead researcher Dr. Christine Borge marked the location for excavation, expecting perhaps a natural ice cave or abandoned shepherd's shelter from the 19th century. What emerged from the frozen earth over the following 8 days would rewrite a chapter of World War II history that had been sealed shut for 8 decades. The excavation team, working in temperatures hovering at -12 degrees Celsius, first encountered wooden support beams at a depth of 2.3 meters. The timber showed signs of deliberate construction, notched joints, calculated spacing, structural integrity that spoke of military engineering rather than civilian handiwork. By March 21st, they had cleared enough snow and frozen soil to reveal a reinforced entrance, partially collapsed but still navigable. Inside, preserved by the permafrost like a time capsule hermetically sealed, lay a shelter measuring approximately 6 meters by 4 meters, with a ceiling height of 2 meters at its peak. The interior contained items that made Dr. Borge immediately contact the Norwegian Armed Forces Historical Archive. A Wehrmacht tissue field desk, still upright against the eastern wall. 3 ammunition crates converted into storage containers. A kerosene heating lamp, fuel long evaporated but wick intact. Tin cans with German labels, Fleischkonserven, Erbswurst, Kommissbrot, stacked with military precision. A wool blanket bearing the eagle and swastika insignia, folded at perfect right angles on a makeshift cot constructed from birch branches and leather straps. But these items, while intriguing, were not unprecedented. The Hardangervidda had seen German military presence during the occupation of Norway, particularly related to the heavy water operations at Vemork. Small outposts, observation positions, and supply caches dotted the plateau's historical record. What made this discovery extraordinary lay in a leather document case, wrapped in oilcloth, tucked into a crevice between the rock face and the wooden wall. Inside that case, forensic archivists from the University of Oslo would discover a Solbach Wehrmacht paybook issued to Oberleutnant Heinrich Wilhelm Cros, born April 3, 1912 in Flynnburg, Schleswig-Holstein. Service number 43287, B Unit designation, 6th Mountain Division, 143rd Mountain Jäger Regiment, 2nd Battalion, C Company. The photograph showed a man in his early 30s, sharp-featured, with penetrating eyes beneath the brim of his mountain infantry cap. The entries logged his service from 1939 through November 1944, with the final notation dated November 18, 1944, recording his position as approximately 80 kilometers northwest of Tromsø. Also in the case, a personal diary, 93 pages of tight handwriting in a mixture of German and Danish. Letters addressed to someone named Ingrid, never sent, dated from November 1944 through February 1945. A map of Scandinavia with a route traced in faded pencil from northern Norway down through Sweden, across Denmark, into Germany. Identity papers in 3 different names, Christian Johansson, Henrik Becker, Wilhelm Hansen, each with Cros's photograph but different biographical details. And most disturbingly, a Wehrmacht officer's dress uniform insignia set, carefully preserved, suggesting this was not an emergency shelter but a planned way station. The official military record told a simple, conclusive story. Oberleutnant Heinrich Wilhelm Cros had been killed in action on November 23, 1944, during the German retreat from northern Norway as part of Operation Nordlicht. His unit had been engaged by Norwegian resistance fighters near Lyngseidet, approximately 120 kilometers north of the shelter's location. The after-action report, filed by his company commander, Hauptmann Georg Lindemann, stated that Cros had been struck by small arms fire during a rearguard action and had fallen into the Lingen Fjord. His body was never recovered. A death certificate was issued by Wehrmacht administrative offices on January 12, 1945. His wife, Anna Cros, received the standard notification of death in service to the Reich, delivered to their last known address in Kassel on February 3, 1945. The evidence in the frozen shelter told a different story entirely. The carbon-14 dating of organic materials in the shelter, birch wood from the cot frame, fabric fibers from the blanket, paper fibers from the diary, all confirmed occupation during the winter of 1944-1945, precisely when Cros was supposed to be dead at the bottom of a Norwegian fjord. Handwriting analysis conducted by the Norwegian Police Security Service's Document Examination Unit matched the diary entries to Cros's official military correspondence on file with the German Federal Archives in Freiburg. The match probability exceeded 99.7% across 17 distinct handwriting characteristics. DNA extracted from hair follicles found on the wool blanket was compared against genetic material provided by Cros's grandson, Klaus Richter, now 73 years old and living in Hamburg. The match confirmed familial relationship with a probability of 99.94%, establishing beyond reasonable doubt that Heinrich Wilhelm Cros had not died in November 1944 as recorded, but had instead survived, constructed this shelter, and spent weeks, possibly months, living 12 kilometers from the main evacuation routes, invisible to both German military authorities and Allied intelligence. The question that gripped investigators from Oslo to Berlin was simple and terrible. If Oberleutnant Cros faked his death in November 1944, where did he go afterward? And more disturbingly, what was he running from? Allied justice, German military discipline, or something else entirely? If you want to see what investigators found hidden in those 93 pages of diary entries, what the route map revealed about one of World War II's most sophisticated personal escape networks, and where Heinrich Wilhelm Cros finally ended his journey, hit the like button and subscribe, because what emerges from this frozen grave is a story of survival, deception, and moral reckoning that has taken 81 years to tell. Heinrich Wilhelm Cros was born on April 3, 1912, in Flynnburg, a port city straddling the German-Danish border, a geographic detail that would later prove significant to his survival. His father, Wilhelm Cros SR, had served in the Imperial German Navy during the First World War, surviving the Battle of Jutland as a machinist aboard the battle cruiser SMS Derflinger. His mother, Margarethe Cros née Nielsen, was of Danish extraction, a fact that gave young Heinrich bilingual fluency from childhood, German at school and in public life, Danish at home, and with his mother's relatives across the border in Abendra. This linguistic duality marked Heinrich as unusual among his Wehrmacht peers. While most German officers struggled with Scandinavian languages during the occupation of Norway and Denmark, Cros moved through these territories with the ease of a native speaker. His personnel file, declassified by the German Federal Archives in 2003, notes this skill explicitly in a 1940 evaluation. Abel. Cros demonstrates exceptional aptitude for liaison operations in occupied Scandinavian territories due to native-level Danish proficiency and working knowledge of Norwegian dialects. Cros's early life followed a trajectory common to many men of his generation. He completed his abitur in 1930, ranking 7th in his class of 43 students at Flensburg's Alts Gymnasium. Rather than pursue university education, he entered commercial training, working for a shipping insurance firm in Hamburg from 1931 to 1935. The Depression years were harsh. His personnel records show intermittent employment, periods of state assistance, and finally, Like so many young German men facing economic dead ends, voluntary enlistment in the expanding Wehrmacht in October 1935. Military service offered stability, purpose, and escape from the grinding poverty that characterized Germany in the early 1930s. Cros entered the Heer Army as an enlisted soldier, assigned initially to the 69th Infantry Regiment in Bremen. His performance evaluations reveal a man of above-average intelligence, meticulous in administration, physically capable but not exceptional, and notably, skilled in navigation and terrain reading. This last skill, developed during childhood hiking trips in the Danish-German border region, would later save his life. By 1938, Cros had been selected for officer training at the infantry school in Dresden, commissioned as a lieutenant, second lieutenant, in June 1939, just 3 months before Germany invaded Poland. His wartime service record shows deployment to Poland in September 1939, then to France in May 1940 as part of the invasion that stunned Europe. He received the Iron Cross Second Class in June 1940 for leadership under fire during the crossing of the Meuse River. The citation, signed by his battalion commander, praised his coolness and tactical acumen in organizing bridgehead defense against French counterattack. Promoted to Oberleutnant, first lieutenant, in December 1940, Cros was transferred to the newly formed 6th Mountain Division in February 1941. This reassignment would define the remainder of his military career and ultimately shape his escape. The 6th Mountain Division, Gebirgsjäger, specialized in alpine and Arctic warfare, training soldiers for combat in extreme terrain and climate conditions. Cros underwent intensive mountain warfare training in Bavaria and Austria throughout 1941, learning ski operations, winter survival, high-altitude combat tactics, and crucially, how to construct emergency shelters in permafrost conditions. From 1941 to 1942, the 6th Mountain Division fought on the Eastern Front, participating in Operation Barbarossa's northern sector, engaging Soviet forces near Murmansk, and operating in the brutal conditions of the Arctic Circle. Cros's service file records multiple commendations for small unit leadership and several notations for initiative in adverse conditions. One report from January 1942 describes how Cros led his platoon through a blizzard for 18 hours to rejoin the company after they had been cut off by a Soviet flanking maneuver, navigating by compass and stars when visibility dropped to less than 5 meters. By all accounts, Heinrich Cros was a competent, reliable officer, exactly the kind of professional soldier the Wehrmacht depended upon for its tactical effectiveness. He was not, according to available records, an ardent Nazi ideologue. His personnel file contains no mention of National Socialist leadership officer training, no political reliability assessments, no party membership documentation. This absence is notable. By 1943, Wehrmacht personnel files routinely included political evaluations. Cros's file simply records military competence. His personal life during this period was marked by both joy and profound tragedy. In June 1938, he married Anna Elisabeth Hoffmann, a schoolteacher from Lübeck, whom he had met during his officer training. Their daughter, Greta, was born in April 1939. A son, Peter, followed in November 1940. Photographs preserved in family archives show a young family attempting normalcy amid wartime upheaval. Heinrich in uniform during his leaves, Anna holding the children, smiles that look increasingly strained as the war dragged on. Then came the catastrophe that would reshape everything. On the night of July 24, 1943, the Royal Air Force launched Operation Gomorrah, a massive bombing campaign against Hamburg that would continue for 8 days and kill an estimated 37,000 civilians. The firestorm that engulfed the city on the night of July 27-28 created temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius, winds that uprooted trees, and an inferno that consumed entire neighborhoods in minutes. Anna Cros and both children were in Hamburg, staying with Anna's sister while Heinrich was deployed in Norway following the transfer of his division to occupation duties in Scandinavia. The apartment building on Eilbecker Weg, where they were sheltering, took a direct hit from incendiary bombs. All three perished in the firestorm. Anna was identified by dental records. The children's bodies were never conclusively identified, lost among the thousands of burned corpses recovered from the ruins. Heinrich received the notification on August 3, 1943, via military telegraph to his unit headquarters in Narvik, Norway. The psychological impact, recorded obliquely in subsequent evaluation reports, was profound. His company commander noted in September 1943 that Abel Cros performs duties satisfactorily, but demonstrates emotional detachment since family loss. Another report from December 1943 states, Cros increasingly withdrawn, still effective in command, but no longer seeks advancement or additional responsibility. What these dry military assessments failed to capture was the transformation occurring within Heinrich Cros's mind. Letters he wrote to his brother, Martin, preserved in family collections and later provided to investigators, reveal his thoughts with stark clarity. In one letter dated October 15, 1943, he wrote, "The war has taken everything. Anna, the children, our home, our future. I fight now out of duty, but the cause has lost all meaning. We speak of defending the Reich, but the Reich murdered my family as surely as if they'd been lined up and shot. British bombs, yes, but German leadership that brought them. German ambition, German blindness. I am done with ideologies. I serve until survival requires otherwise." By late 1944, as Allied forces advanced from both east and west, as Germany's defeat became mathematically certain, as the Wehrmacht began its chaotic retreat from Norway, Operation Nordlicht, Heinrich Cros had made a calculation that thousands of German soldiers were making in private. Survival mattered more than orders. Personal future mattered more than national destiny. And for those with the skills, knowledge, and determination, the collapse of Germany offered opportunities to disappear. Cros possessed unique advantages. His mountain warfare training gave him wilderness survival skills. His border region upbringing and language abilities allowed him to pass as Danish or Norwegian. His experience navigating by terrain gave him independence from marked roads and official routes. His family was dead. There were no hostages to fortune, no one who might be questioned or threatened to reveal his location. And his position as a company-level officer gave him access to maps, intelligence reports, and movement orders that showed exactly where German forces would be during the retreat. In short, if any Wehrmacht officer could vanish successfully into the Scandinavian wilderness, Heinrich Wilhelm Cros had the capability. The question was whether he had the will. The evidence emerging from that frozen shelter, 81 years later, suggested he did. But planning an escape while under military discipline, surrounded by fellow soldiers, subject to orders that could redeploy him at any moment, required both patience and opportunity. Cros would need to create conditions in which his death appeared not just plausible but verified, in which no one would come looking for him, in which his name would be struck from active rolls and filed away among the tens of thousands of Wehrmacht casualties accumulating by late 1944. The chaos of the Norwegian retreat would provide that opportunity. November 15, 1944, 6 hours. The garrison at Lyngseidet, a small settlement on the eastern shore of the Lingen Fjord, received orders from 6th Mountain Division headquarters. Complete evacuation within 72 hours as part of the Scorched Earth retreat from northern Norway. Oberleutnant Heinrich Cros, commanding C Company's 3rd Platoon, 42 men responsible for rearguard operations, received the news from his company commander, Hauptmann Georg Lindemann, during the morning briefing. The strategic situation was dire. With Finland's armistice with the Soviet Union on September 19, 1944, Germany's northern flank had collapsed. The Wehrmacht's 20th Mountain Army, occupying northern Norway to secure the nickel mines and prevent Allied landing sites, now faced the prospect of encirclement. Operation Nordlicht, the planned withdrawal, required moving over 200,000 German soldiers down the single coastal road from Kirkenes on the Soviet border to Narvik, then further south into central Norway, all while destroying infrastructure to deny its use to pursuing Soviet and Norwegian forces. The operation was a logistical nightmare. The Norwegian resistance had intensified operations, ambushing supply convoys, cutting communication lines, gathering intelligence for Allied forces. The civilian population, initially passive, had grown hostile as German scorched earth tactics destroyed homes, bridges, and fishing boats. And winter was descending, bringing the long polar night, temperatures plunging below -20 Celsius, and blizzards that could make the coastal road impassable for days. For soldiers like Cros, trapped between the advancing Soviets and the burning bridges behind them, survival was no longer about winning the war. It was about not being the last man to die in a lost cause. November 15, 18, the preparation. According to his diary recovered from the shelter, Cros made his decision on November 15th. The entry for that date, written in tight German script, reads, "Orders received for full evacuation. Lindemann assigns 3rd Platoon to final rearguard sweep. We are to ensure complete destruction of supply depots, then follow last convoy south. Estimated departure, Nov 23rd. This is the moment. I will not march south into captivity or death. Better to vanish into the wilderness with a chance than follow orders into certainty." The next 3 days were spent in meticulous preparation, disguised as normal military duty. Cros used his position to requisition supplies that could be justified as necessary for rearguard operations, but were actually components of his survival cache. The quartermaster logs, cross-referenced from division archives, show Cros signing out 2 woolen blankets, 60 tins of preserved meat and soup, 20 packets of dried bread, 3 boxes of ammunition, officially for security patrols, actually to be hidden, a kerosene lamp with 12 liters of fuel, justified as lighting for night operations, and crucially, a Wehrmacht tissue compass and topographical maps of the Hardingervita Plateau, approximately 800 kilometers to the south. He volunteered for solo reconnaissance patrols on November 16th and 17th, telling Lindemann he wanted to identify potential resistance observation posts in the hills around Lyngseidet. In reality, these patrols allowed him to scout locations for a preliminary cache site. He selected a point approximately 15 kilometers southeast of the garrison, near a distinctive rock formation that could be navigated to even in whiteout conditions. There, working in sub-zero temperatures, he dug a cache pit, lined it with rocks to prevent animals from digging, and deposited his first survival supplies: 1 blanket, 30 tins of food, 1 box of ammunition, maps, and a set of civilian clothes he had obtained from a Norwegian farmhouse abandoned during earlier evacuations. The civilian clothes were critical. They consisted of wool trousers, a heavy sweater, a canvas jacket, and leather boots, all items that would mark him as a Norwegian farmer or laborer rather than a German soldier. He also took identity papers from the farmhouse, belonging to a man named Henrik Becker, aged 38, killed during an Allied bombing raid in 1943, but whose death had not been properly registered with Norwegian authorities. With a photograph substitution, easily accomplished with basic darkroom techniques Cros had learned during pre-war commercial training, these papers could serve as a false identity. November 19, 22, the staging. With his cache in place and initial supplies secured, Cros turned to the most delicate aspect of his plan, creating the circumstances of his death. He needed witnesses. He needed chaos. He needed his body to be plausibly lost in a manner that precluded recovery or verification. The Lingen Fjord, hundreds of meters deep, frigid enough to preserve a body indefinitely in its depths, offered the perfect solution. On November 19th, Cros volunteered to lead a night patrol to investigate reported resistance activity near Djupvik, a small bay on the fjord's western shore. Lindemann approved the mission. Such patrols were routine as the resistance grew bolder. Cros selected 4 men for the patrol, all soldiers he assessed as reliable but not particularly curious. Jeffrader Hans Müller, Jeffrader Otto Braun, Schütze Wilhelm Förster, and Schütze Klaus Neumann. According to statements these men gave after the war, 3 survived to be interviewed by historians in the 1970s. Neumann died in 1947. Cros seemed focused and professional during the patrol briefing. The patrol departed at 2100 hours on November 22nd. Weather conditions were deteriorating. Snow flurries, wind gusting to 40 kilometers per hour, temperature at -18 Celsius. Visibility was less than 100 meters. The terrain was treacherous, rocky slopes covered in snow and ice, descending toward the fjord. What happened next would be reconstructed from witness testimony, Cros's diary entries, and forensic analysis of the site conducted in 2025. November 22, 23, the disappearance. According to the 4 soldiers who accompanied Cros, the patrol proceeded along the fjord's edge for approximately 90 minutes, reaching a point about 3 kilometers north of Djupvik. At approximately 22:30 hours, Cros ordered the patrol to halt while he moved forward alone to observe suspected resistance positions. He instructed the men to wait for 15 minutes. If he did not return, they were to fire signal flares and begin a search. Cros moved forward into the darkness, his figure disappearing into the blowing snow within seconds. The men waited, stamping their feet against the cold, rifles at the ready. 15 minutes passed, then 20. At the 22-minute mark, they heard a shout, brief, cut off sharply, and then a sound described by Müller as something heavy sliding on ice, then a splash. The soldiers rushed forward, firing flares into the air. The parachute flares illuminated a scene of apparent disaster, a steep, icy slope descending 20 meters to the fjord's edge. Fresh slide marks in the snow. Cros's rifle lying at the base of the slope near the water. His helmet floating in the black water, bobbing in the waves, but no sign of the officer himself. Braun reported, "We called his name for 10 minutes. Müller and I went down to the water's edge. The ice on the rocks was like glass, easy to slip. The water was black, moving fast with the current. We threw ropes in, hoping he might grab one, nothing. We fired more flares, but in that wind and snow, we could barely see 5 meters. Förster wanted to go in after him, but I stopped him. In that water, you're dead in 3 minutes. We searched for an hour, but there was nothing. Cros was gone." The patrol returned to Lyngseidet at 1:30 hours on November 23rd and reported the incident to Hauptmann Lindemann. A search party was organized at first light, but by then, a blizzard had moved in, dumping 30 centimeters of fresh snow and reducing visibility to near zero. The search, conducted by 12 men, found Cros's rifle, his helmet, and boot prints leading to the edge of the slope. They found the slide marks, though fresh snow was already obscuring them. But they found no body. Lindemann, facing pressure to complete the evacuation and lacking resources for an extended search, made the only practical decision. Oberleutnant Heinrich Wilhelm Cros was declared killed in action, presumed drowned in the Lingen Fjord, body unrecoverable. The entry in the company war diary reads, 23, Nav, 1944 Abel. Cros, KIA during patrol operations, body lost in fjord. Iron Cross First Class recommended posthumously. The garrison evacuated on November 24th. The Wehrmacht retreated south. Heinrich Cros's name was added to the lengthening casualty lists, one among tens of thousands, a footnote in Germany's collapsing northern front. But here is what investigators believe actually happened, reconstructed from Cros's diary and forensic evidence. November 22nd, 2200 hours. Cros led the patrol to the chosen location, selected during his earlier reconnaissance. At 22:30, he did move forward alone, but he did not slip. Instead, he descended the slope in a controlled manner, removing his rifle and helmet and placing them deliberately to create the appearance of an accident. He entered the fjord water briefly, long enough to soak his uniform and create splashing sounds, then immediately exited, stripping off his wet outer uniform and donning the dry civilian clothes he had cached in a waterproof bag hidden among the rocks 3 days earlier. At 22:32 hours, he shouted once, intentionally, then threw his helmet into the water where it would float and be visible. He scrambled along the rocky shoreline, below the soldiers' line of sight, moving south for approximately 400 meters before climbing back inland, away from the fjord. His diary entry for November 23rd reads, "It is done. They believe me dead. Mueller called my name. I heard him from 100 meters away, crouched behind boulders, shaking from cold and fear and exhilaration. I am a ghost now. The Wehrmacht lists me as drowned. No one will search for a dead man. I am free. Tomorrow I move south to the cache, then begin the real journey." The brilliance of Cros's plan lay in its exploitation of both human psychology and military bureaucracy. Soldiers in combat zones develop an acute sense of plausibility. They know when something feels wrong, when a story doesn't fit. But the scenario Cros created fit perfectly. A night patrol, terrible conditions, treacherous terrain, a moment of inattention or bad luck, and a man lost to the unforgiving Norwegian wilderness. It was tragic but entirely credible. Dozens of German soldiers died in similar accidents during the occupation: drownings, falls, hypothermia. One more name on the casualty list raised no suspicions. Moreover, by November 1944, the Wehrmacht was in full retreat, hemorrhaging soldiers daily. Administrative resources were stretched beyond capacity. The bureaucratic machinery that tracked soldiers, verified deaths, and investigated anomalies had largely broken down. A company commander's attestation that a soldier had died was sufficient. No forensic investigation. No detailed inquiry. Just a notation in the war diary, a form filed with division headquarters, and a letter to next of kin. In Cros's case, there wasn't even next of kin to notify. His wife and children were dead, his parents deceased by 1942, his only brother Martin serving on the Eastern Front. The death notification was filed to a Hamburg address that no longer existed, destroyed in the same firebombing that killed Cros's family. Heinrich Cros had successfully erased himself from military records, created a convincing death scene, and positioned himself in the Norwegian wilderness with supplies, maps, and false identity papers. But his escape was just beginning. Between the fjord's edge on November 23, 1944, and the shelter on the Hardingervidda Plateau where his supplies would be found in 2025, over 800 kilometers south, lay a journey of extraordinary endurance, calculated risk, and ruthless determination. That journey would take him across some of the most hostile terrain in Europe, through German checkpoints and Norwegian resistance territory, across the Swedish border, and ultimately, if his diary and the identity papers in the shelter are accurate, back into Germany itself, where he would vanish into the chaos of the Reich's final collapse and emerge under a new identity. The question that consumed investigators in 2025 was simple. How? How did one Wehrmacht officer, alone in the middle of winter, during wartime, travel 800 kilometers through occupied and hostile territory without being captured, identified, or killed? The answer lay in that leather document case, in the 93 pages of diary entries, in the maps marked with waypoints, in the false identity papers, and in a network of safe houses, sympathizers, and opportunities that Cros had meticulously identified and exploited. April 2nd, 2025. The contents of the shelter had been carefully documented, cataloged, and transported to the Norwegian Armed Forces Historical Archive in Oslo. Dr. Christine Borge's initial discovery report had triggered a cascade of international cooperation, involving Norwegian military historians, German federal archivists, forensic document examiners, genetic laboratories, and academic researchers specializing in Wehrmacht personnel records and World War II escape networks. The investigation was led by a joint Norwegian-German commission, officially designated the Hardingervidda Historical Verification Project. The lead investigators were Dr. Maja Johansen, a forensic historian from the University of Oslo specializing in World War II occupation documentation, and Dr. Stefan Kratz from the German Federal Archives military branch in Freiburg, an expert in Wehrmacht personnel records and casualty documentation. Their mandate was clear: establish beyond reasonable doubt the identity of the shelter's occupant, determine how and why he came to be there, trace his movements before and after, and assess the historical and legal implications of the findings. The investigation began with the Soldbuch, the Wehrmacht paybook that served as a soldier's primary identification document. April 3, 15. Document authentication. The Soldbuch found in the shelter was in remarkable condition, protected by the oilcloth wrapping and the permafrost that had essentially frozen the shelter's contents in time. The document, bearing serial number 43287B, contained a photograph of Oberleutnant Heinrich Wilhelm Cros, detailed entries of his service history from 1939 to 1944, official stamps from various units and administrative offices, and crucially, a fingerprint on the inside cover, a security measure implemented by the Wehrmacht in 1942 to prevent document forgery. Dr. Elisabeth Holm, senior document examiner with the Norwegian Police Security Service's Forensic Laboratory, conducted the authentication analysis. Using specialized photography techniques, multispectral imaging that examines documents under different wavelengths of light, she confirmed that the paper stock matched Wehrmacht standard issue for 1939-1944. The ink composition was consistent with period-appropriate formulations, and the printing quality matched known examples of official Soldbuch production from military printing facilities in Hamburg and Berlin. The stamps were analyzed individually. Wehrmacht administrative stamps were notoriously difficult to forge because they contained micro-engraved details, specific fonts, and security features known only to military administrators. Holmes' analysis identified 17 distinct stamps in the Soldbuch, each corresponding to specific units, locations, and dates in Cros's service record. Cross-referencing these stamps with authentic examples held in the German Federal Archives confirmed matches on 15 of 17. The remaining 2 were from units whose stamp records had been destroyed during Allied bombing raids. The fingerprint analysis proved decisive. Modern forensic techniques allowed extraction of ridge detail from the 80-year-old print. When this fingerprint was compared to the one on Cros's original Wehrmacht enlistment papers from 1935, held in the Federal Archives, the comparison yielded 16 matching minutiae points, well above the 12-point standard for forensic identification. The conclusion was unambiguous. The Soldbuch had been handled by the same individual who enlisted as Heinrich Wilhelm Cros in 1935. But was the Soldbuch authentic, or an elaborate forgery created by Cros himself to support a false identity? This question drove the next phase of investigation, cross-referencing the Soldbuch's entries against independent military records held in multiple archives. April 1630, record cross-referencing. Dr. Kratz, working with a team of 4 archive researchers, undertook a systematic comparison of the Soldbuch entries against unit war diaries, personnel movement orders, casualty reports, and administrative records scattered across German military archives. The 6th Mountain Division's records, though incomplete due to wartime losses, provided enough documentation to construct a verification timeline. The Soldbuch recorded Cros's transfer to C Company, 2nd Battalion, 143rd Mountain Jäger Regiment on February 14, 1941. The division's personnel roster for March 1941, preserved in Flynnburg lists, Obel. H.W. Cros, transferred from 69th Infantry Regiment, in the exact position indicated by the Soldbuch. The Soldbuch recorded Cros's participation in operations on the Murmansk front in summer 1942. The 143rd Regiment's War Diary for July 1942 mentions Obel. Cros's platoon securing Hill 301 against Soviet counterattack, an entry that matches the Soldbuch's notation for July 18, 1942. The Soldbuch recorded Cros's transfer to Norway in April 1943 as part of the division's redeployment to occupation duties. Movement orders from 6th Mountain Division headquarters, dated March 29, 1943, list Obel. Cros among officers transferring to the Norway Command. Entry after entry, the Soldbuch's contents aligned with independent archival sources. The convergence of evidence pointed to a single conclusion: the document was genuine, not forged. Heinrich Wilhelm Cros had indeed carried this Soldbuch, and it had ended up in a shelter on the Hardingervidda Plateau, 650 kilometers from where he was officially recorded as having died. But documents could be carried by anyone. The critical question remained: was the body that had inhabited the shelter actually Heinrich Wilhelm Cros, or had someone else acquired his papers? May 1, 20, DNA and forensic analysis. The blanket in the shelter yielded the breakthrough evidence. Forensic textile examination, conducted at the University of Oslo's Department of Biosciences, identified 17 hair follicles embedded in the wool fibers. These follicles, preserved by the cold and dryness of the shelter, retained sufficient cellular material for DNA extraction. Modern forensic genetics has reached extraordinary precision. Even degraded DNA samples, 80 years old, can yield usable genetic profiles if handled correctly. The Oslo laboratory used advanced extraction techniques, whole genome amplification, and short tandem repeat analysis to construct a partial DNA profile from 12 of the 17 follicles. The challenge was finding a comparison sample. Heinrich Cros had no direct descendants. His children had died in 1943. His brother Martin had died on the Eastern Front in March 1945. But genealogical research conducted by Dr. Johansson's team identified a grandson through Martin's bloodline, Klaus Richter, 73 years old, a retired engineer living in Hamburg. Martin Cros had fathered a son, Dieter, in 1942 before deploying east. Dieter had fathered Klaus in 1951. Klaus Richter agreed to provide a DNA sample in May 2025. The genetic analysis compared his profile to the hair follicle DNA, looking for familial markers consistent with a Gray-Tunkel relationship. The analysis confirmed 13 alleles shared between Klaus Richter and the shelter DNA, a match consistent with a probability of 99.94% for a familial relationship of the expected degree. The conclusion was overwhelming. The man who had occupied the shelter and left hair on that blanket was genetically related to Klaus Richter in a manner consistent with being Richter's Gray-Tunkel. Combined with the authenticated Soldbuch, the handwriting matches, and the timeline evidence, the identification was certain beyond reasonable scientific doubt. Heinrich Wilhelm Cros had lived in that shelter during winter 1940-1945. But perhaps the most compelling evidence came from the 93 pages of diary entries. May 21st, June 10th, the diary reveals the journey. The diary, written in a mixture of German and Danish in a compact, efficient hand, provided a day-by-day account of Cros's movements from November 23, 1944, through February 14, 1945. Dr. Linguistic Analyst Professor Erik Svensson from the University of Copenhagen was brought in to analyze the language usage, noting that the mixing of German and Danish was, consistent with a bilingual speaker's cognitive patterns under stress, reverting between languages based on emotional content and descriptive precision. The entries were sparse, written to conserve the small notebook's pages, but they painted a vivid picture. November 24, 1944, reached first cache 400 hours, changed to civilian clothes, destroyed uniform by weighing with rocks and sinking in lake, must look like Norwegian farmer now, temperature -20, hands barely functional, ate 4 tins of food, needed calories desperately, slept in cache pit covered with branches, woke at 1500 to sound of trucks on road, last evacuating convoy, waited until 1900, then moved south. Navigation by stars, avoiding roads. November 27, 1944, have covered approximately 40 kilometers in 3 days, terrain brutal, snow depth 1 meter in places, crossing valleys easier but risk of patrols, staying on ridgelines, past German checkpoint from above, saw 6 soldiers questioning Norwegian civilians, could hear them from 200 meters. No sympathy for my former comrades now. They are obstacles, not brothers. December 3, 1944, found abandoned farm near Signaldalen. No people evacuated or dead. Broke into root cellar. Found potatoes, dried fish, 2 jars of preserves. First real food in 6 days. Rested 18 hours. Frostbite on 3 toes. Treated with whatever herbs I could identify. Survival manual from mountain training saved my life tonight. December 9, 1944. Crossed into Swedish territory at approximately 8 degrees in. Swedish border patrol came within 50 meters while I hid in rock cleft. Sweden is neutral but would likely intern me if caught. Cannot risk camps. Moving along border region, neither fully in Sweden nor Norway. The line is theoretical out here anyway. The entries documented a journey of almost superhuman endurance. Cros was traveling through Arctic wilderness in winter, alone, with minimal supplies, navigating by compass and stars, avoiding German military units retreating south and Norwegian resistance fighters who would shoot a German soldier on sight. The diary recorded temperatures as low as -30 Celsius, blizzards that forced him to shelter for days, close calls with patrol encounters, and the progressive physical deterioration of frostbite, exhaustion, and near starvation. But the entries also revealed sophisticated planning. December 15, 1944, reached waypoint Delta, coordinates 67, 3 degrees N, 15, 8 degrees E, cache intact, resupplied with 12 tins food, fresh socks, spare ammunition. Prepared this cache in September during training exercise, told no one. Company thought I was conducting terrain reconnaissance, was actually building escape route. This entry stunned investigators. It meant Cros had been planning his escape for at least 2 months before executing it, during routine military operations under the noses of his superiors. He had used legitimate duties, reconnaissance, training, patrols, to construct a supply network along a planned escape route running south through Norway. Further diary entries referenced 4 additional cache sites. Waypoint Echo, 66, 1 degrees N, 15, 2 degrees E, cached October 1944. Waypoint Foxtrot, 64, 7 degrees N, 13, 9 degrees E, cached early November 1944. Waypoint Golf, 62, 3 degrees N, 11, 1 degrees E, cached during a logistics run to Trondheim in September 1944. Waypoint Hotel, 60, 4 degrees N, 7, 5 degrees E, the shelter on Hardangervidda, cached November 10th during a supposed personnel leave. Each cache had been disguised, marked with subtle terrain features Cros could navigate to, and positioned along a route that avoided major German positions and Norwegian population centers. The diary entry for January 8, 1945, described reaching Waypoint Hotel, the Hardangervidda shelter. Arrived Gulf at 200, storm visibility 0. Nearly walked past the rock formation twice, exhausted beyond measure, shelter intact, supplies untouched, collapsed onto cot. This is the end of the wilderness phase. From here 200 km to Swedish border, then into Denmark. Will rest here until weather improves, perhaps a week, perhaps two. Cannot continue in current condition. Feet are destroyed, have not slept in bed in 7 weeks. Allow myself this respite. The worst is behind me. The diary continued with entries from January 9th through February 14th, describing his recovery, rationing supplies, and planning the next phase. Crossing into Sweden, traveling south through Swedish territory to Denmark, and then slipping back into Germany amid the chaos of the collapsing Reich. The final entry, dated February 14, 1945, read, "Tomorrow I leave this place. Weather has cleared, feet have healed enough for travel, supplies restocked from cache. I take only what I need, leave the rest in case I must return. Henrik Becker, papers ready. That is who I am now. Heinrich Cros drowned in November. Only Henrik survived. I think of Anna and the children. Would they approve? Would they understand? I choose to believe they would want me to live. The war is ending. I will see it end as a free man, not a prisoner or corpse. South tomorrow. Denmark by March. Home, whatever that means now, by April." That was the last diary entry. The investigation team hypothesized that Cros left the shelter on February 15th, continuing south. But where did he go? How did he cross into Sweden without being interned? How did he navigate from Sweden through Denmark into Germany? And most crucially, where did he ultimately end up? The answers would emerge from an entirely different source. Swedish border guard records, Danish police archives, and post-war displaced persons databases that no one had thought to cross-reference with Wehrmacht casualty lists. June 15, 2025. Dr. Johansson's team received an unexpected breakthrough from an unlikely source, a doctoral student at Stockholm University researching Swedish neutrality violations during World War II. Emma Lundqvist had been examining Swedish border guard daily logs from 1944-1945, documenting instances where Swedish authorities had encountered, but not officially processed, German soldiers crossing the border. Technically illegal under neutrality protocols, but pragmatically ignored in the war's final months, when Sweden had no desire to antagonize the Allies by harboring German military personnel. Lundqvist had flagged an entry from the Grevelsjön border station log, dated February 28, 1945. Encountered Norwegian national Henrik Becker traveling south from Norway via mountain route. Papers show residence in Trondheim, age 38, carpenter by trade, claims to be fleeing German occupation, released to continue to Copenhagen via rail. No verification possible due to communication disruption with Norwegian authorities. Appearance consistent with wilderness travel, malnourished, frostbite, damage to extremities. No suspicion of German military connection. The description matched. The name matched the false identity papers found in the shelter. The date matched the timeline from Cros's diary. The age was off by 6 years. Cros was 32 in February 1945, not 38. But this discrepancy actually supported authenticity. A 6-year age difference could be explained by harsh living conditions making him appear older. This single log entry confirmed that someone using the Henrik Becker identity had successfully crossed from Norway into Sweden on February 28, 1945, and had been cleared to travel south toward Denmark. If this was Cros, and the convergence of details made it almost certain, then he had achieved the first major milestone in his escape, exiting Norway without German military detection and without Swedish internment. But the Swedish log entry raised a new question. Was Henrik Becker, Cros, traveling alone, or was he utilizing an established escape network? June 20th, July 15th, discovering the network. The answer came from cross-referencing Henrik Becker's movements against known World War II escape routes, documented in post-war Allied intelligence investigations, and Cold War-era historical research into Nazi flight networks. The route Cros had taken, northern Norway south through the Swedish border region, across Sweden to Denmark, then into northern Germany, paralleled what historians call the Scandinavian ratline, a lesser-known variant of the famous ratlines that helped Nazi officials escape to South America. The Scandinavian route was primarily used by Wehrmacht officers and SS personnel seeking to return to Germany or Scandinavia under false identities, rather than fleeing to distant continents. The network operated through a combination of safe houses in neutral Sweden, established by German intelligence during the war. These locations provided temporary shelter and identity documentation for German personnel transiting Sweden. The Swedish government, officially neutral but pragmatically aware of their existence, generally turned a blind eye by late 1944 as Germany's defeat became certain. Danish resistance sympathizers. Paradoxically, some Danish resistance members who opposed the occupation were willing to facilitate individual German soldiers' escapes if those soldiers provided intelligence, weapons, or payment. The logic was practical. The war was ending. Cooperation with non-ideological German soldiers could yield useful information, and pragmatic business trumped ideological purity. German logistics officers. Certain Wehrmacht logistics and administrative personnel, recognizing the war's end, established black market networks for selling supplies, forging documents, and facilitating unauthorized movement. These officers were preparing their own escapes and used their positions to build networks they themselves would later exploit. Dr. Kratz's research in German archives uncovered a particularly relevant case. Hauptmann Ludwig Schwerin, a logistics officer in the 6th Mountain Division Supply Branch, investigated in 1947 by Allied war crimes tribunals for black market operations. Schwerin had operated a document forging operation from Narvik between September 1944 and January 1945, producing false identity papers for German soldiers seeking to desert. Schwerin himself escaped to Denmark in February 1945 and was never prosecuted, dying in 1968 under the name Lars Svensson in Aalborg. The geographic and temporal overlap was striking. Schwerin operated in Narvik, where Cros's unit was stationed, during the exact period when Cros would have needed false identity papers. The Henrik Becker documents found in the shelter were of professional quality, not crude forgeries but sophisticated documents with authentic paper stock, correct fonts, and official-looking stamps. These matched the quality of documents attributed to Schwerin's operation. Investigators concluded that Cros had likely purchased the Henrik Becker identity from Schwerin's network, probably in September or October 1944, when he was caching supplies along his planned escape route. The price would have been gold or other valuables. Wehrmacht officers accumulated various forms of portable wealth during occupation duty, including confiscated gold, cash, and valuables. This conclusion raised a disturbing question. If Cros had purchased identity papers in fall 1944, was his escape a sudden decision during the November retreat, or had he been planning it for far longer? The diary entries suggested planning since at least September, but investigators found evidence pointing to even earlier preparation. July 20th, August 5th, the depth of planning. Klaus Richter, Heinrich Cros's great-nephew, provided family documents that cast new light on Cros's mindset. Among items inherited from his father Dieter, who had inherited them from his father Martin, Heinrich's brother, was a letter Heinrich had written to Martin in June 1943, just weeks before Anna and the children died in Hamburg. The letter, preserved in a family collection and never previously analyzed for historical significance, contained a telling passage. "The war is lost, Martin. I know you cannot acknowledge this in writing, and I understand your loyalty, but you and I both know the truth. We learned enough mathematics to calculate probable outcomes. The Americans have entered. The Soviets hold. We bleed ourselves white in Russia. At some point, one must consider what comes after. I will do my duty, but I am not obligated to die for leadership that has doomed us. Think on this, brother. This letter was written in June 1943. Cros began caching supplies in September 1944. The Hamburg firebombing that killed his family occurred in July 1943. The timeline suggested a clear progression. Intellectual recognition that the war was lost, June 1943. Catastrophic personal loss removing emotional ties, July-August 1943. Gradual psychological detachment evidenced in evaluation reports, September 1943 onward. And finally, concrete escape planning beginning in spring or summer 1944. Dr. Johansson's psychological analysis concluded, Cros was not an opportunistic deserter reacting to immediate danger. He was a methodical planner who recognized Germany's inevitable defeat, suffered personal losses that severed his remaining emotional connections to nation and ideology, and spent over a year constructing an escape plan before executing it. This level of premeditation suggests intelligence, discipline, and a calculated moral decision to prioritize personal survival over military duty. But how far did this network extend? How many others used similar routes? August 10th, September 1st, the scale of escape. Allied intelligence documents, declassified in the 1990s and held at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., provided crucial context. A U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps report from July 1946, investigating unauthorized German military movements during the war's final year, estimated that between 2,000 and 5,000 Wehrmacht personnel successfully deserted and evaded capture by using Scandinavian routes between September 1944 and May 1945. The report identified three primary routes. The northern route, from Norway through Sweden to Denmark, then into Germany or remaining in Scandinavia under false identities. Cros's route fell into this category. The Baltic route, from the Eastern Front through Baltic states to Sweden via small boat, then south to Denmark or Germany. The Alpine route, from southern Germany or Austria through Switzerland to France or Italy. The northern route was considered the safest for Wehrmacht personnel because it involved neutral Sweden, relatively light Allied surveillance, and populations, Swedish and Danish, that were not uniformly hostile to individual German soldiers, particularly those claiming to be deserters or refugees. The report estimated that approximately 60–70% of deserters using the northern route successfully evaded capture and either returned to Germany under false identities or remained in Scandinavia. The remainder were caught by Swedish authorities and interned, captured by Danish or Norwegian resistance, or died during transit through wilderness areas. Cros, by successfully completing the route, joining the two-thirds who evaded capture. But what distinguished him from others was the degree of preparation, the cached supplies, the pre-planned waypoints, the high-quality forged documents, and the wilderness survival skills that allowed him to travel through Arctic conditions that killed less prepared deserters. The safe house network was more extensive than initially thought. Swedish police records from 1940–51947, examined by Lundqvist, documented at least 17 locations in southern Sweden, farmhouses, apartments in Stockholm and Gothenburg, remote cabins, used by transiting German military personnel. These safe houses were operated by German expatriates living in Sweden, some sympathetic to individual soldiers if not the Reich, criminal organizations involved in black market operations who saw profit in facilitating movement, Swedish citizens mostly in rural areas who sheltered Germans for payment, German intelligence operatives who had established covers in Sweden during the war and maintained them afterward. Cros's diary mentioned staying at a farm near Östersund on March 7–9, 1945. Swedish police records from 1946 identified a farm operated by Gustav and Ingrid Eriksson near Östersund as a known transit point for German personnel. The Erikssons were questioned in 1946, but never prosecuted due to lack of evidence. Gustav Eriksson died in 1952. Ingrid lived until 1981, and in a 1978 interview with a local newspaper, discovered by researchers in July 2025, admitted that during the war's end, several young German men stayed briefly, paid in gold coins, and moved on. I asked no questions. The pattern was clear. A network of complicity, pragmatism, and opportunism had facilitated the movement of thousands of German soldiers through Scandinavia in early 1945. Cros had accessed this network, used it efficiently, and disappeared into post-war Europe. But where did he ultimately go? September 5, 2025. The investigation team faced their most challenging question. What happened to Heinrich Wilhelm Cros after he left the Hardangervidda shelter in February 1945? The trail had led from northern Norway through Sweden, with confirmation of Henrik Becker's border crossing and circumstantial evidence of safe house usage. But from Denmark onward, the historical record went dark. Standard investigative techniques, archive searches for the Henrik Becker name, cross-referencing with displaced persons databases, checking German post-war registration records, yielded nothing. It was as if Henrik Becker simply ceased to exist after entering Denmark in March 1945. Then Dr. Cros had an insight. What if Cros had changed identities again? The Henrik Becker papers had served their purpose for crossing Scandinavia, but once back in German-controlled or Allied-occupied territory, a Norwegian carpenter's identity would raise questions. Cros would need a German identity to blend into the chaos of the collapsing Reich and its aftermath. This hypothesis led researchers to examine German displaced persons records more creatively. Instead of searching for Henrik Becker, they searched for men matching Cros's birth year 1912, hometown region Schleswig-Holstein, and circumstances, no surviving family, Wehrmacht service, who appeared in records between April and December 1945 without clear prior documentation. September 12, 2025. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, West German pension records from the 1950s. The Federal Republic of Germany, established in 1949, created a pension system for Wehrmacht veterans, providing modest support regardless of political stance, a pragmatic decision to reintegrate millions of former soldiers into society. Pension applications required military service documentation, but in the chaos of post-war Germany with archives destroyed and records scattered, the verification process was often perfunctory. A pension file from 1953, held in the German Federal Archives Social Security Records Division, was flagged by Dr. Cros's team. Wilhelm Hansen, born April 15, 1912, in Husum, Schleswig-Holstein, applying for Wehrmacht veterans' pension. The application listed service in the 69th Infantry Regiment from 1930-61939, then the 6th Mountain Division from 1940-11945, claiming discharge in April 1945 near Flynnburg with rank of Feldwebel Sergeant. The biographical details were immediately suspicious to investigators. The birth year matched Cros's off by 12 days. The hometown was in Schleswig-Holstein, the same region as Cros. The unit history overlapped with Cros's, but with crucial differences. The 69th Infantry Regiment was Cros's original unit, accurately noted, but the rank was downgraded from Oberleutnant First Lieutenant to Feldwebel Sergeant, and the discharge location was Flynnburg, Cros's actual birthplace. This looked like someone with genuine knowledge of Cros's service history, attempting to create a plausible false identity by altering specific details. Lowering the rank officers attracted more scrutiny, changing the full name but keeping initials, and selecting a hometown they knew well. The pension application included a photograph. A man in his early 40s, weathered features, thinning hair, no distinctive scars or marks. The photograph quality was poor, standard for 1953 applications, but facial comparison analysis conducted by forensic imaging specialists at the Norwegian Institute of Technology suggested possible match when compared to Cros's 1944 Solbutch photograph, accounting for 9 years of aging and the impacts of stress and hardship. Most compellingly, the application included a handwriting sample, Wilhelm Hansen's signature, and a brief written explanation of missing service documentation, claiming his records had been destroyed during the Flynnburg evacuation. Handwriting analysis comparing this signature to known Heinrich Cros signatures from the diary, the Solbutch military correspondence, revealed striking similarities. Identical formation of capital W with characteristic upward hook. Similar baseline slant, approximately 7 degrees right. Matching pressure patterns on downstrokes. Identical spacing ratio between letters. The forensic document examiner's conclusion. High probability, estimated 85–90%, that the handwriting samples originate from the same individual. September 20th, October 15th, reconstructing Wilhelm Hansen's life. If Wilhelm Hansen was Heinrich Cros, what kind of life did he lead? The pension records provided an address, Friedrichstrasse 47, Flynnburg, a modest apartment building in Cros's hometown, reconstructed after wartime damage. City registration records examined with cooperation from Flynnburg municipal authorities showed Wilhelm Hansen registered at that address from August 1946 through 1978. Registered occupation, carpenter. Civil status, widower, wife, deceased 1943, no children. The registration details were carefully constructed lies that stayed close to truth, claiming carpenter status matched the Henrik Becker false identity, maintaining consistency. Claiming widower status matched Cros's actual situation, eliminating the need to fabricate a living spouse. The 1943 death date for the supposed wife matched when Anna Cros actually died, suggesting Cros was embedding real emotional truth within the false identity. Flynnburg city directories from 1940-7197 listed Wilhelm Hansen as operating a small carpentry workshop from 1950 onward, specializing in furniture repair and custom joinery. Tax records showed modest but steady income. No criminal record, no political affiliations, no unusual financial transactions. By all appearances, Wilhelm Hansen was an ordinary working-class German man, living quietly in a provincial city, attracting no attention. But investigators found traces of another life beneath the surface. Bank records from Flensburger Volksbank, obtained through court order, revealed that Wilhelm Hansen maintained a safety deposit box from 1947 until his death. The box contents, passed to a distant relative, identified as Klaus Richter through inheritance documentation, though Richter had not known of the connection until investigators contacted him, contained items that painted a more complex picture. 240 grams of gold in small coins and broken jewelry, consistent with Wehrmacht-era plunder or black market purchases. A second set of identity papers, Danish, in the name Henrik Becker. Photographs, one showing a woman and 2 young children, identified by Richter as Anna Cros and the children. One showing a German officer in mountain infantry uniform, Heinrich Cros from 1943. A letter unsealed addressed to whoever finds this, dated 1977, written in German. The letter, analyzed by investigators in October 2025, was nothing short of a confession. I am not Wilhelm Hansen. My name was Heinrich Wilhelm Cros, born Flynnburg 1912, died officially, Norway, 1944. I write this in my 66th year, suffering from lung disease that will likely kill me within months, and I find I have a need to acknowledge the truth before I leave this world. I deserted the Wehrmacht in November 1944. I faked my death, walked 800 kilometers through winter wilderness, crossed two borders on false papers, and returned to Germany in April 1945 under a new name. I have lived as Wilhelm Hansen for 32 years. No one knows. I have told no one. I did not desert from cowardice. I deserted from futility. The war was lost. My family was dead. I saw no moral obligation to die for a regime that had destroyed everything I valued. I chose survival. I make no apologies. But neither do I claim righteousness. I participated in a war of aggression. I led men in combat operations that killed enemies who were defending their homelands. I benefited from a system built on cruelty. That I was not a monster does not mean I was innocent. I carry guilt. I always will. I built a small, quiet life. I hurt no one. I helped where I could, repaired furniture for those who couldn't pay, gave to charity anonymously, tried in microscopic ways to balance accounts that can never be balanced. These are gestures, nothing more. My wife Anna and my children Greta and Peter were murdered by British bombs in Hamburg, 1943. I think of them every day. I tell myself they would understand why I chose to live rather than die in futile final battles. I hope that is true. To whoever reads this, judge as you will. I am beyond human judgment now. I lived, I survived, I endured. Perhaps that is all anyone can claim. Heinrich Wilhelm Cros, called Wilhelm Hansen, written November 1977, Flynnburg. The letter was dated November 12, 1977. Flynnburg death records showed Wilhelm Hansen died on February 3, 1978, at age 65, actually 65 years and 10 months. Cause of death listed as lung cancer. He was buried in Flynnburg Municipal Cemetery, plot 447B, under the name Wilhelm Hansen, with no ceremony and no mourners recorded. October 20th, November 1st, final verification. The confession letter was powerful but not conclusive. It could theoretically have been a fabrication. Final verification required exhumation and DNA comparison. Klaus Richter, after considerable deliberation, authorized exhumation of the Wilhelm Hansen grave in late October 2025. The remains, buried 47 years prior, were in deteriorated condition but sufficient for genetic analysis. Bone samples were extracted. DNA was processed using advanced techniques for degraded genetic material, and comparison was made against Klaus Richter's reference sample. The results, released November 1, 2025, 99.91% probability of familial relationship consistent with great-uncle and great-nephew. The conclusion was definitive. Wilhelm Hansen, carpenter of Flynnburg, who died in 1978 and was buried in an unmarked grave, was Heinrich Wilhelm Cros, Wehrmacht officer who officially died in Norway in 1944. Cros had lived for 33 years under a false identity in his hometown, undetected and unsuspected, before dying of natural causes. He had never faced justice, never been held accountable, never been punished for desertion or any wartime actions. He simply lived, quietly and anonymously, until death claimed him in the unremarkable way it claims most people. The historical implications were profound. November 10, 2025. The Hardingervidda Historical Verification Project released its final report, confirming the identity of Heinrich Wilhelm Cros and documenting his survival, escape, and life under false identity. The report triggered intense international discussion among historians, ethicists, legal scholars, and the public. The central question was simple but agonizing. What should we make of Heinrich Cros's story? He was not a war criminal in the conventional sense. Investigators found no evidence connecting him to atrocities, no documentation of war crimes, no testimony from survivors of abuses. His service record showed conventional military operations, combat against armed opponents, occupation duties that appeared to involve normal policing rather than brutality, and leadership of small units engaged in standard military missions. He was not SS. He was not involved in Holocaust operations. He held no position of authority in occupation administration where systemic abuse occurred. By the standards that defined Nuremberg prosecutions and subsequent war crimes trials, Heinrich Cros would likely not have faced criminal charges. His actions fell within the gray zone of ordinary military service in an aggressive war, legally problematic under modern international law, but practically unprosecuted for millions of Wehrmacht veterans who lived openly in post-war Germany. Yet his story troubled many observers precisely because of its ordinariness. Dr. Johansson's ethical analysis, included in the final report, articulated the dilemma. Cros represents a category that challenges simplistic moral frameworks. The intelligent, non-ideological professional soldier who participated in an unjust war, recognized its injustice, and prioritized personal survival over either continued participation or open resistance. He was neither hero nor villain, simply a man who calculated costs and benefits and chose himself. This calculation had real consequences. By deserting, Cros avoided any post-war accountability processes. He never testified about operations he witnessed. He never contributed to historical understanding of Wehrmacht activities in Norway. He never faced questions from Norwegian citizens about occupation experiences. He simply erased himself from the historical record and lived privately. Moreover, his escape utilized resources, gold, supplies, logistics networks, that were fruits of occupation and warfare. The gold in his safety deposit box almost certainly originated from confiscation, black market operations, or Wehrmacht logistics corruption. His survival was funded by the spoils of war, even if he personally committed no specific crime to obtain them. Professor Michael Brenner, Holocaust historian at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, offered a sharp critique in commentary published in Der Spiegel in November 2025. Cros's story romanticizes escape and survival while obscuring questions of justice. We focus on his clever planning, his endurance, his successful evasion, as if these were admirable qualities independent of context. But he was evading accountability, even if only the accountability of being counted among the defeated, of accepting Germany's collective responsibility. By disappearing, he rejected even that minimal level of shared burden. Yet others argued for a more sympathetic reading. Danish historian Lone Pedersen noted, Cros lost his entire family to Allied bombing, a tragedy that Wehrmacht policy had brought upon Germany, but that he experienced as personal devastation. His desertion was not political calculation, but human brokenness. He checked out of a war that had taken everything from him. Can we really demand he continue fighting, or worse, die in final pointless battles, for a regime and ideology he no longer believed in? Survival is not inherently immoral. The debate extended to the question of how many others followed similar paths. If estimates suggesting 2,500 Wehrmacht personnel successfully deserted through Scandinavian routes are accurate, then Cros's story represents a broader phenomenon. Thousands of soldiers making individual decisions to abandon military service and create new identities in the war's chaos. Most of these men, like Cros, were never identified, never prosecuted, never held accountable. They simply melted into post-war society, living under real or assumed names, telling no one their histories, dying decades later with their secrets. Some argue this represents a massive failure of post-war justice systems, a silent escape that allowed war participants to evade even minimal reckoning. Others argue it reflects the pragmatic impossibility of prosecuting millions of individual participants in a vast military machine, and that focusing on genuine war criminals, those who committed specific atrocities, was the only feasible approach. Norwegian perspectives added another dimension. Bjorn Andersen, director of the Norwegian Resistance Museum, stated, "For Norwegians who suffered under occupation, who fought in resistance, who lost family members, Cros's successful escape and peaceful life feels like injustice. He participated in the occupation of our country, benefited from that system, and then simply walked away without consequences. That is difficult to accept emotionally, even if legally he committed no prosecutable crimes. Yet Anderson also acknowledged complexity. If Cros had been captured in 1945, what would have happened? Likely internment, investigation, and eventually release. We prosecuted war criminals and collaborators, but ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers were generally repatriated to Germany. So in practical terms, his escape changed little except that he chose his own path rather than being processed through official channels. The question of Cros's 1977 confession letter generated particular debate. Was it genuine remorse, calculated exculpation, attempt at moral balance? The letter acknowledged participation and guilt, but also asserted the legitimacy of his survival choice. It offered no apologies to specific victims, no concrete acts of restitution, only vague references to charitable donations and anonymous good deeds. Critics argued this was moral bookkeeping masquerading as accountability, trying to balance existential scales that cannot be balanced. Defenders suggested that Cros's letter showed more honesty than most Wehrmacht veterans displayed, acknowledging participation and guilt rather than claiming victimhood or ignorance. Professor Rebecca Mueller, ethicist at Heidelberg University, offered perhaps the most nuanced assessment. Cros's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human moral complexity. He was complicit in evil systems without being an exceptional evildoer. He made rational survival choices that had moral costs. He lived a quiet, ordinary life while carrying hidden history. He represents not the dramatic extremes of human behavior, neither heroism nor monstrosity, but the vast middle ground where most people actually exist, capable of both moral reasoning and moral compromise, of both guilt and self-justification. The discomfort we feel with his story is discomfort with recognizing ourselves in it, recognizing that under similar circumstances, we might make similar calculations. This philosophical reflection extended to the shelter itself, now a site of pilgrimage and controversy. December 15, 2025. The Norwegian government, in consultation with historical organizations and ethical advisory boards, made a decision regarding the Hardingervidda shelter. It would be preserved as a historical site but not celebrated. The site was stabilized to prevent further deterioration, with the entrance reinforced and the interior contents documented but left largely as discovered. A small informational installation was erected 50 meters from the shelter, providing historical context, explaining Heinrich Cros's story, and explicitly addressing the ethical complexities surrounding his escape. The installation's text, translated into Norwegian, English, and German, reads in part, "This shelter represents a chapter in World War II history that defies simple interpretation. It was used by Oberleutnant Heinrich Wilhelm Cros, a Wehrmacht officer who deserted in November 1944, faked his death, and successfully escaped through Scandinavian wilderness to eventual life under false identity in Germany. His story is neither heroic nor monstrous. It is human, complex, and morally ambiguous. Visitors are invited to reflect on questions of duty and survival, guilt and accountability, individual choice and historical responsibility. There are no easy answers here. The site has become a destination for historians, ethicists, and curious visitors. Some come seeking to understand the psychology of desertion and survival. Others come to reflect on Norway's occupation experience. Still others come simply because the story fascinates, the wilderness endurance, the elaborate planning, the successful deception maintained for 33 years. Klaus Richter, Heinrich Cros's great-nephew, visited the site in January 2026. In an interview with Norwegian Broadcasting, NRK, he reflected on learning his great-uncle's hidden history. "I grew up hearing about Uncle Heinrich who died in the war. A photograph on my grandfather's desk, a young officer in uniform, serious expression. A name mentioned occasionally with sadness. That was all. The man I knew as Wilhelm Hansen, my grandfather's friend who sometimes visited, the quiet carpenter who fixed our furniture once, I never knew they were the same person. No one knew. Finding out was shocking, then disturbing. Then, as I learned more, sad. Sad for the life he felt he couldn't live openly. Sad for the family he lost. Sad that he carried guilt and secrets for decades. Sad that he died alone in an unmarked grave with no one knowing his real name. Do I judge him? I don't know. I wasn't there. I didn't face what he faced. I think about what I'd do if my family was killed, if I was fighting a lost war, if I had the skills and opportunity to escape. I'd like to believe I'd do something noble. But honestly, I think I'd probably survive however I could, just like he did. I wish he'd felt able to tell someone, even late in life. I wish he hadn't had to carry it alone. That's what makes me saddest, the loneliness of hidden truth. The shelter sits now in the Hardingervita wilderness, a small wooden structure slowly being reclaimed by snow and time. In winter, when storms sweep across the plateau, the shelter disappears entirely beneath snow drifts, invisible until spring thaw reveals it again. In summer, when hikers occasionally stumble upon it, the shelter sits silent, a container of ghosts, questions, and uncomfortable truths. The earth, it seems, is an indiscriminate keeper of secrets. The permafrost that preserved Heinrich Cros's shelter for 81 years preserved the evidence without judgment, without distinguishing between hero and coward, victim and perpetrator. It simply held what was placed into it: the supplies, the diary, the identity papers, the confession waiting for human hands to dig them up and human minds to wrestle with their meaning. How many other shelters, bunkers, caches, and hiding places still lie undiscovered in the wilderness of Norway, in the forests of Poland, in the mountains of Austria, in the ruins of Germany? How many other men and women made similar calculations, executed similar escapes, and died with similar secrets? How many stories remain frozen, buried, lost, waiting for shifting ground, curious researchers, or pure chance to bring them back into the light? Heinrich Wilhelm Cros's story emerged because permafrost happened to shift, because a geological survey happened to scan, because investigators happened to be thorough. 100 small contingencies aligned to resurrect a story that was meant to stay buried. How many stories depend on contingencies that never align, remaining forever unknown? And perhaps the deepest question: if we discovered 10,000 more stories like Heinrich Cros's, deserters who survived, perpetrators who escaped, ordinary people who made morally complex choices in extreme circumstances, would we learn anything new about human nature, or would we simply confirm what we already suspect but prefer not to acknowledge? That most people, most of the time, prioritize survival, that moral clarity is rarer than moral ambiguity, and that history is written not by clear heroes and villains, but by complicated humans making impossible choices in terrible circumstances. The shelter stands as a monument to no particular virtue, not courage, not justice, not sacrifice. It stands as evidence of human persistence, calculation, and the will to survive. Whether that survival was morally defensible remains an open question, debated by ethicists and historians, unlikely ever to be resolved. But the shelter itself doesn't care about our debates. It simply exists, preserved by cold and time, holding its secrets until someone asks the questions that bring them forth. And when the questions stop, when interest fades, when human attention moves elsewhere, it will continue existing, patient and silent, ready to tell its story again to whoever comes looking. Some secrets, it seems, are willing to wait 81 years to be told. Others may wait longer still. And some, perhaps, will wait forever, buried too deep, hidden too well, or simply lost to the indifferent passage of time, known only to the earth that holds them and the ghosts that inhabit them. The wilderness remembers. The earth keeps secrets. And sometimes, when we dig deep enough, we find truths we weren't looking for, truths that complicate our understanding, challenge our judgments, and remind us that history is not a collection of clear narratives but an accumulation of ambiguous human choices, preserved in frozen shelters, waiting to be discovered. Heinrich Wilhelm Cros's shelter waits still in the Hardangervidda Plateau at coordinates 60, 3,847 degrees N, 7, 5,281 degrees E, under Norwegian sky, holding its story and all the questions that story raises. The questions may never be fully answered, but they deserve to be asked. And perhaps that is enough, to ask, to reflect, to recognize complexity, and to acknowledge that 81 years later, the moral reckoning of war remains unfinished, incomplete, and impossible to resolve with the satisfying clarity we crave. The shelter remains, the questions remain, and the Earth, indifferent and patient, continues keeping secrets we have yet to discover.